She was barefoot, bleeding, and carrying the weight of a collapsed empire. He was sunburned, dusty, and holding a rifle slung over his shoulder like a shovel at dusk. Their eyes met in the ruins of Luzon, not as enemies, but as strangers born into opposite lies. She spoke first. Her voice was raw, cracked by fear and hunger, but her words in broken English were unmistakable. "I'll be your wife," she said. Not a plea, not a bargain, a declaration. The cowboy blinked. He didn't laugh. Behind them, the war still smoked. Around them, the jungle hissed with heat and history. What followed was not a romance, not a miracle, but something more dangerous, a quiet detonation of every story they had ever been told. She had been trained to kill him. He had been trained not to see her as human. And yet here they stood, a Japanese nurse with no shoes, a Texas ranch hand turned soldier, facing each other not as soldier and prisoner, but as man and woman in a war that was supposed to erase both. The heat that rose between them was not just tropical, it was the kind of heat that only came after death, after fire, after a silence too thick to breathe. The jungle behind her still whispered with flies and ghosts. Trees were split open from mortar fire. Charred palm fronds drooped like wet paper. And out in the clearing, the air shimmered with that heavy, post-battle stillness, the kind that sticks to your ribs and won't let go. She was limping. Her knees were scraped raw. A bloodstain the size of a child's hand had bloomed across her hip. But she did not look down. She walked with her chin high, the sun in her face, and a gaze that didn't beg. It dared. The cowboy saw her before the others did. He'd been sitting on an ammo crate, cigarette clamped in the corner of his mouth, watching the flies circle a busted canteen. He blinked twice when she appeared through the trees, barefoot, uniform torn, hands empty. A few other soldiers rose behind him, rifles halfway lifted. She kept coming, slow, deliberate. One hand hovered near her side, fingers twitching slightly, as if muscle memory still wanted to reach for a weapon she no longer carried. When she stepped into full view, they saw she was young, maybe 20, maybe younger. Her eyes were lined with ash and fever, but they were not afraid. Someone whispered, "She's surrendering." Another muttered, "Could be a trick." But she raised her arms, palms out, no weapon, no shame, just bone and dust and an unreadable calm. The cowboy stood. He didn't shout, didn't gesture, just looked at her, his hand resting near his belt, not on his pistol. His Stetson tilted back. Sun caught the sweat on his temples. He said nothing. She stopped 10 paces away. The silence held. Then came the sentence, broken and halting, as if she had practiced it 100 times in her mind before speaking it aloud. I'll be your wife." The words fell like a grenade into the clearing. No one moved. One soldier actually laughed once, then swallowed it when he saw the cowboy's face. The nurse didn't flinch. She stared at him like he was a doorway, not to safety, but to something else, something stranger. Her voice wasn't pleading. There was no flirtation, no desperation, just certainty, as if offering herself was a kind of last weapon. He stared at her. "What did you say?" She repeated it, slower. "I be wife." The cowboy didn't smile. He didn't scowl either, just blinked, like someone trying to remember a language they'd half forgotten. The jungle around them buzzed. A few men lowered their rifles. One cursed under his breath. She took a single step closer. The sun caught the sweat on her neck. Flies landed on her sleeve, and she didn't brush them off. He looked at her feet, blistered, cut, caked in black mud. She had come far, not just miles, but through something deeper, through war, through death, through a belief system that told her this was worse than dying. The cowboy finally spoke. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded. He nodded back, slow as a church bell. "All right, let's get you some food." The spell broke, but only slightly. A medic stepped forward warily. Another soldier pulled a canteen from his belt. The cowboy kept his eyes on her, not like she was fragile, but like she was made of something no one understood yet, something dangerous. Not because she had a weapon, but because she had given up the weapon and still stood tall. In the days to come, soldiers would joke about it behind mess tents. "Hey, where's your wife, cowboy?" someone would say. But he never answered, not really, because he knew what he'd seen. A woman walking toward a gun, not with fear, but with a kind of terrible grace. And somewhere in the haze of that scorched afternoon, amid the flies and the gun oil and the ash, something inside both of them had already begun to shift. The war was still happening around them, but between them, something else had started. It didn't have a name yet, but it would. Before she ever saw the cowboy, before she even knew what America smelled like, she had already broken the first and deepest law of her world. She had chosen to live, not to fight, not to die in a final blaze of loyalty, but simply to keep breathing. In the barracks of the Imperial Japanese Army's Medical Corps, survival was not seen as strength. It was a kind of rot. The code they whispered in the dark was older than the war itself. Bushido, a word that tasted like iron and ash. It meant loyalty until death. It meant your blood was not your own. She had repeated the phrases over and over during training, watching girls younger than her pass out from heat stroke or blood loss and get carried away like scraps. They were not taught to ask why. They were taught to bind wounds without flinching, to inject morphine without hesitation, to treat screaming soldiers with eyes blank as paper. Food came in handfuls of rice, if it came at all. Water was boiled moss. The injured soldiers arriving from the front were sometimes missing arms, sometimes minds. Her job was to make them quiet, not whole. They trained her to recognize screams by pitch and to work with the speed of someone who knew time was never on their side. The officers barked orders like scripture, their boots ringing against bamboo floors. She stitched flesh by candlelight and wiped blood with her own sleeves when gauze ran out. She saw girls die of infection. One slipped in a latrine and hit her head. No one cried. Grief was indulgence. Empathy was dangerous. When they heard the Americans were approaching Luzon, orders shifted. They were told to burn documents, destroy medicines, bury the wounded who could not walk. "Do not let them take you," one officer said. "To surrender is to spit in the emperor's face." They handed out grenades to some of the men, cyanide to others. The women were told to use whatever they had, scissors, scalpels, their own hands if it came to that. She didn't take the knife they offered. She nodded like the rest. She even recited the vow again, her voice firm, but inside something cracked. That night, as explosions bloomed like ghostly flowers in the distant trees, she lay on her mat, the blanket pulled to her chin, and thought about her mother. Not the emperor, not the generals. Just her mother's hands, rough from rice harvests, her mother's quiet voice saying, "Live if you can, even if it shames you." The next morning she found the body of a fellow nurse hanging from a rope behind the tents. Another lay with her throat open on a mat, eyes glassy with something that wasn't peace. The shame closed in like fog, but her feet were already moving. She did not take the medical bag. She did not take food, only water and a small notebook wrapped in cloth. And she walked into the jungle, past the boundary markers, past the line where pride ended and instinct began. For 3 days she walked barefoot, her skin blistered. She drank from streams laced with ash. At night she listened for voices, sometimes Japanese, sometimes not, and hid in roots or behind the wrecks of burned-out tanks. She spoke to no one, not even herself. On the 4th day, she found a crumpled wrapper on the ground. American rations. She stared at it like it was a map. By then, her body was losing strength, but her mind had sharpened into something dangerous. She had made a choice, a forbidden, unthinkable, irreversible choice. Not just to live, but to live long enough to see. And when she stumbled into the clearing, when the cowboy looked at her without hatred, she understood that whatever came next, mockery, prison, or worse, she had already committed the greater sin. She had not died, and now she would see what lived in the eyes of the enemy. And neither had he, though by the time he met her, something inside him had already stopped breathing. The war hadn't killed him, not in the way it killed some of the others, fast, with bullets or shrapnel or fire. It got him slower, with silence, with the weight of things not said. But long before Luzon, before the jungle and the flies and the heat that stuck to your soul, he was just a boy on the plains of Amarillo, Texas, where the wind never stopped and the land taught you how to listen before it taught you how to speak. He grew up among cattle and dust, real dust, the kind that coated your teeth and made your skin feel like paper by the end of the day. His father ran the ranch with a spine of leather and a Bible always close, but barely read. His mother died when he was 12. After that, the only softness in his life came from horses, and even they didn't stay long. Men in his world didn't cry. They didn't complain. They tipped their hats at funerals, kept their boots clean, and believed that God noticed men more when they suffered quietly. He wasn't the fastest roper or the best shot, but he was steady, dependable, the kind of man other men didn't worry about. By 18, he could drive a steer across state lines, change a carburetor with his eyes closed, and stay silent through the worst kind of news. He loved the land, the routine, the rhythm of hoofbeats in dirt. He hadn't meant to go to war, but when the draft letter came, he folded it twice and put it in his back pocket, then finished feeding the horses before telling his father. Boot camp hit like a bad joke. Noise, crowds, orders barked by boys who hadn't held a branding iron in their lives. The barracks smelled like mildew and sweat. He hated the shouting, the forced camaraderie, the way everything felt like theater. But he didn't break. Not then. He just pulled further inward. The other recruits called him Cowboy, partly because of the accent, partly because of the way he stared past people like he was always watching the horizon. Then came the Pacific, and nothing could have prepared him for it. Not the jungle, not the rot, not the way the air never cooled. It was a place built to kill slowly. He saw boys younger than him waste away from dysentery. He saw friends go home in bags, zipped too fast for prayer. He watched a man bleed out holding a picture of a baby that would never learn his name. In Okinawa, he found part of a friend's boot still attached to a foot. In New Guinea, he held a dying man's hand for an hour because there was no one else who could. He didn't talk about these things, not then, not later. But they sat in his chest like rusted nails. He didn't hate the enemy, not really. He didn't even understand them. But the war taught him to stop expecting meaning. Orders were orders. Death came quick. Sometimes it came slow. What mattered was who you were when it didn't come. By the time he made it to Luzon, he wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was just tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. He didn't joke like the others, didn't drink much either. But when the nurse stepped out of the trees and said what she said, something moved in him he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not love, recognition. Because something about the way she stood there, dusty, proud, utterly done with the war but still standing, reminded him of something he'd seen only once before, a horse too wounded to run but too proud to kneel. And in that moment he understood her better than he understood the war itself. She didn't understand him, not fully, but she understood the way his eyes didn't flinch when they met hers. That was new. That was dangerous, because everything she'd ever been told had prepared her for something else. The moment her knees hit the ground at the edge of the camp, she braced for it, the backhand, the laughter, the boots on her spine. Instead, someone handed her water. Another handed her a towel. She flinched when fingers touched her arm, but the pressure was gentle. They didn't bind her. They didn't spit. She was marched through the camp, and every step felt like walking deeper into a riddle. The barbed wire was there, yes, the guard towers, the rifles slung across shoulders. But no one shoved her. No one barked. The air smelled like stew. The sky above the barracks was clean and blue, and the faces of the other prisoners, Japanese women like her, were not contorted in agony. They looked tired, fed. One was even reading. When they gave her a cot, she didn't lie down at first. She stood over it like it might vanish. The blanket was soft. The pillow smelled like starch. A tin plate sat at the foot of the bed with bread on it. Real bread, not the sawdust kind, not rice crusts. She stared at it for a long time. Then, slow as prayer, she reached out and took a bite. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed with her knees tucked up, listening to the camp breathe around her. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing a harmonica. The notes floated like smoke. She didn't know the tune, but it was soft, lilting, almost playful, as if music could still exist here, as if beauty hadn't been outlawed. The next morning, he was there again. The cowboy. He didn't wear his hat inside the mess tent, but she recognized him anyway, that same quiet around him, that same look of someone watching without judgment. She hadn't expected to see him again, but when their eyes met across the breakfast line, he nodded once, like they shared a secret. When she reached the food counter, she hesitated. The smells were too good, eggs, bacon, something sweet, and her stomach twisted with suspicion. This was the moment, she thought. This is where the trick begins. But the man behind the counter just said, "Eat up," and handed her a tray. She took it, sat alone, ate with shaking fingers. A shadow passed her table. The cowboy. He didn't sit, didn't speak, just set down a small tin cup of coffee beside her plate, nodded again, and walked away. No smirk, no smugness, just kindness, like it cost him nothing. It undid her more than cruelty ever could. Later that day, they took her to the showers. She expected it to be a ritual of humiliation. She had heard the rumors, what Americans did to women. But when she stepped into the tiled room, they handed her soap. Real soap, thick, heavy, fragrant. She sniffed it once and nearly wept. The water came hot. It stung her skin, burned the filth from weeks in the jungle. She scrubbed herself until she was raw, not to clean herself, but to prove it was real. No one rushed her. No one watched. She stood under that stream until her legs gave out, and then she sat on the tile floor, water cascading over her like grace. Later, wrapped in a towel too clean for war, she caught her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Not an enemy, not a ghost, a girl. And for the first time since her capture, maybe even longer, she felt something rise in her chest that terrified her more than death ever had. Hope. It clung to her in ways she hadn't expected. Not loud or bright, but quiet, like mist before dawn. And it made her dangerous again. Not because she wanted to escape, but because now she had something to lose, something soft growing in a place meant only for hard edges. That week, she began noticing him more often, not because he loomed, but because he didn't. The cowboy walked through the camp like someone who belonged to the earth and not the war. He never lingered, never looked too long, but when he passed her, his eyes always said, "I see you." The camp had rules: no fraternizing, no casual talk between guards and POWs. Women were kept separate from the main barracks. Contact was limited, supervised, regulated like water from a canteen. But rules were made for a world that didn't account for what silence could carry. And theirs was a language made of glances, nods, small exchanges that the war forgot to forbid. It began in the laundry tent. She was folding blankets, hands chapped, when he walked by and dropped something without stopping. A small, leather-bound book. She hid it quickly, heart racing. Later, alone, she unwrapped it and found an English-Japanese dictionary, half missing its cover, the pages dog-eared and worn. Inside the front flap, he'd scribbled one sentence in pencil: "Start with John, page 100. She didn't know what John meant, but she found the page, finger trembling, and read slowly. In the beginning was the word. She didn't understand most of it, but she whispered the English sounds over and over, shaping her mouth around them like seeds. She repeated them while folding towels, while eating, while brushing her hair. She didn't believe in the God behind those verses, not yet, but she believed in the sound of them, the rhythm, the strange, fragile beauty of being taught a new way to speak by someone who never asked her for anything in return. They saw each other in stolen minutes, a hallway near the infirmary, the edge of the vegetable garden where she worked when her leg began to heal. Sometimes he passed by, handed her a note folded in wax paper. "Brother Ototo," one read. Another, "What did your sky look like before the war?" She didn't always answer with words. Sometimes she drew mountains, a small house, 2 boys fishing. He understood. She told him, haltingly, about her brothers lost in Saipan. He told her about a dog he had in Texas, a horse he named after his mother. These were not declarations. They were confessions made to air, not expecting an echo. But still, echoes came. He struggled too. Each time he looked at her, a part of him recoiled. "Enemy," it whispered. "Spy, liar, trap." But those thoughts felt thinner now, like ghosts. What sat in front of him wasn't a cause or a uniform. It was a girl who had chosen to live when she wasn't supposed to. That was more American than enemy, he thought, and maybe that was the problem. At night, he lay in his cot and stared at the ceiling, feeling something shift in him. Not love, not yet, but a breaking, a loosening. The war had taught him to lock himself tight. She, without knowing, was picking those locks with nothing more than borrowed words and the steadiness of her eyes. She, too, was changing. The shame she'd worn like armor was cracking. What was this feeling that made her stomach twist when she saw him, that made her breath catch when she heard his voice? It wasn't desire, not the way she'd been warned about. It was something older, softer, like home, if she could remember what that word meant. They never touched, never dared, but in that camp, barbed wire above, rules pressing in from every side, they were learning something neither of them had been taught, that even in war, kindness could be the most dangerous rebellion of all. It didn't take long for others to notice. Camps were built on routine, but they thrived on rumor. Eyes followed her now, not with fear, but suspicion. Whispers traveled faster than orders. Some of the Japanese nurses began turning their backs when she entered a room. One hissed the word "urajirimono" under her breath. Traitor. Another refused to share a work assignment with her. They had all survived the same hunger, the same indoctrination, but she had crossed an invisible line. She spoke to an American guard. Worse, she spoke to that one. Shame returned in a new shape, not imposed by officers or doctrine, but by peers who needed her to be wrong so they could remain right. At night, she lay awake listening to their murmurs, fingers clutching the edge of her blanket. She reminded herself of what she had chosen: to live, to see. Even if it meant standing alone. The scrutiny reached him too. A sergeant pulled him aside near the supply tent, voice low, careful. "You're getting noticed," he said. "This ain't personal, it's protocol. Keep your distance." He nodded, said yes, sir, the way he always did, but inside something hardened. He'd followed orders that sent boys to die. This one, this quiet cruelty of enforced indifference, felt worse, so they adjusted. They didn't stop. They just became careful. The bar of soap came during a ration change, a new shipment, wrapped in paper stamped with government ink. He noticed her watching the pile, eyes lingering a second too long. He waited until no one was looking, then slipped one bar into his pocket. Later, in the narrow hallway behind the infirmary, he passed it to her without a word. Their fingers brushed. Just once. She stared at the soap like it was contraband, like it might burn her hands. It smelled faintly of lavender. Too clean, too gentle for war. She hid it under her shirt and didn't breathe again until she was alone. That bar of soap became everything they could not say. It was not romance. It was not escape. It was proof. Proof that someone saw her not as an enemy or a problem, but as a person worthy of care. She used it sparingly, breaking off small pieces, saving the rest wrapped in cloth. Every time the scent rose in the steam of her showers, it grounded her, reminded her she was still human. Meanwhile, he wrote a letter home. He sat on his bunk, pencil pressed hard, knuckles white. He told his mother about the heat, the mud, the waiting, about how the war felt endless and quiet at the same time. He wrote about missing the plains, the sound of wind through tall grass. He did not write her name. He did not write what she had said in the jungle. But he wrote this: "There's someone here who reminds me why I don't want to be hard anymore." He paused after that sentence for a long time. Then he folded the paper and sealed it. The rumors didn't stop. They sharpened. One night, another nurse confronted her by the wash basins, eyes blazing. "You shame us," she said. "You make us weak." She didn't answer. There was nothing left to defend. Strength, she had learned, was not always loud. And yet something fragile endured, in glances, in notes, in the shared understanding that this could not last, but mattered anyway. The soap dwindled, the war dragged on, but the quiet rebellion held, not because they believed it would save them, but because in a world built on obedience and destruction, choosing care, however small, was the last freedom left, and neither of them was willing to give that up. The news came not with shouts, but with silence. It was early August, and the sun hadn't yet climbed over the camp fences when a ripple moved through the prisoners, first a whisper, then stillness. The guards knew before the nurses. The officers knew before the guards. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. She was in the garden when she heard. A fellow nurse, the same one who hadn't spoken to her in weeks, said it flatly while pulling weeds. "They've surrendered. We lost." That word, lost, landed harder than a bullet. She didn't cry in front of anyone. But later, curled on her cot, her back to the door, she wept like a child. Not for the emperor, not for her country, for something deeper. The certainty that had once shaped her life like bone had vanished. All the rules, the oaths, the deaths, they had led here, to surrender, to nothing. He didn't seek her out that day. Orders were flying, soldiers were reassigned, paperwork flooded in, and some guards left without warning. The cowboy knew his time in the camp was over. He'd been told he'd be moved to another post near Manila, and after that, maybe home. Home. The word felt distant. But that night, beneath a sky swollen with stars, they saw each other again, near the edge of the camp, where the fence sagged and the world felt wider. She wore a shawl over her shoulders. He held a small flashlight. No one spoke for a while. When he finally did, his voice was low. "They're sending you home?" She nodded. "Soon." He didn't ask where home was. He knew better. Not all homes survive the people who leave them. She looked at him, eyes glassy but steady. "You remember what I said in the jungle?" He nodded. Of course he remembered. "I'll be your wife," she said again. Then, softly, "But this time, I don't mean as a bargain. I meant if I had known you before the war, before all this, I would have followed you home." There were no answers, no promises. The war had stripped too much away. They stood there, silence thick between them, not touching. Then she reached into her coat and handed him a letter. "For your mother," she said. He took it, but it was weeks before he opened it. It was written in simple English, the kind found in pocket Bibles and ration manuals, but the meaning was clear. "He is kind. He listens. He made me believe the world is not only war. Please tell him not to forget that he was my peace." The next morning her train arrived. Repatriation orders came fast. Most of the women were numb. Some smiled like they didn't trust the feeling. She stood near the back of the line, clutching her bundle of clothes, staring out the window as if trying to memorize the air. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he was. Standing at the far end of the platform, hands in his pockets, hat low over his eyes. As the train began to move, she saw him raise one hand, not waving, just there. She pressed her fingers to the glass and closed her eyes. The train pulled away, and the silence they left behind was louder than any goodbye. She returned to a Japan she didn't recognize. Yokohama, once vibrant, stood in ruins, smoke still curling from buildings that no longer had names. Streets had become dust, homes were skeletons, and the people, they moved like shadows, not defeated, just emptied. There were no parades, no welcome, only the hush of shame so heavy it bent backs. She stepped off the boat with a single suitcase and a head full of silence. No one asked her what she'd seen. No one wanted to know what she had chosen. The house she returned to was not the one she had left. Her parents were gone. Her youngest brother's room had been repurposed by neighbors. She lived in a small apartment near the port, working in a clinic that stitched wounds, but never asked their origins. She smiled with her mouth, but never her eyes. And every night, before she lay down, she unfolded a blanket, a plain, olive-drab thing from the camp, and wrapped herself in it like armor. It smelled faintly of soap and smoke, of something once known, now too far to touch. In Texas, the land hadn't changed. The wind still moved through the grass with that low whisper. The cattle still kicked up dust. But to him, it all felt smaller now. After the jungle, after the war, after her, everything felt like an echo. He rebuilt the fences, rode the same trails, but his silence was no longer the stoic kind passed down by fathers. It was the silence of a man who had once touched another world and come back unable to explain it. He never spoke her name, not to his friends, not to the hands on the ranch. But in the top drawer of his nightstand, wrapped in a torn piece of flannel, he kept a small bar of soap. dried now, cracked, but still holding the faintest trace of lavender. Every now and then he'd take it out, hold it in his palm, and close his eyes. He never married. Folks said he was just particular, that he'd seen too much. He let them believe that. On Sundays he'd ride out alone to the back pasture where the sky went on forever and watch the horizon like it might bring something back. She, too, remained unmarried. Suitors came and went, politely, awkwardly. She never let them stay long. There was a softness in her that didn't trust softness any more. Instead, she poured herself into her work. The clinic grew. She trained other nurses. She smiled at their joy, but didn't share it. They called her strong. They called her kind. They never called her lonely. But each year, on the same date, she would take out a letter, faded, worn at the edges, written in English in a man's hand, simple, direct. "There's someone here who reminds me why I don't want to be hard anymore." She read it slowly, lips forming each word as if they still held breath. That was how they lived, not in regret, not exactly, but in the quiet space between what was and what could have been. A bar of soap, a blanket. Two things no longer useful, but never discarded. They carried each other not in photographs, but in gestures, the way she folded sheets, the way he paused at the window at dusk. They never saw each other again. But some things, once given, never leave. If you're still watching and feeling this story, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The year was 1987, and the war had been over for longer than he'd been alive before it began. Time had softened most things. Roads were paved where there had once been dirt. Boys he'd taught to ride horses now had sons of their own. The world, it seemed, had moved on. But some mornings, when the Amarillo air carried that same dry stillness, the past crept close enough to touch. He found the clipping by accident. It was folded into the local paper, halfway through a Sunday edition he barely read anymore. A short international column, book review, Japan. The headline meant nothing to him at first. Memoir of a war nurse released overseas. He would have turned the page if not for a single line, buried deep in the article, almost an afterthought. A Japanese woman writes of an American cowboy who once gave her soap in a prison camp. His hands went numb. The kitchen clock kept ticking. A fly buzzed near the window. The world did not stop. But he did. He read the sentence again and again. The word cowboy sat there like a fingerprint. Not soldier, not guard. Cowboy. His throat tightened. He had never told anyone that detail, not even the men he served with. The paper trembled in his hands. He sat down slowly, as if afraid his knees might give out. The article said the nurse had survived, that she had written about captivity, about dignity, about small mercies that changed her understanding of the enemy. It did not give her name in English, only a translation. It did not mention the jungle, or the offer, or the goodbye, but it mentioned the soap, and that was enough. He folded the paper with care, like something fragile, and slipped it into his pocket. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of him, the old habits returning. He sharpened his pencil twice, wrote a sentence, crossed it out, wrote another. His hand, once so steady with reins and rifles, now shook. What could he say? That he remembered her? That he had kept the soap? That he had carried her with him through seasons and storms? All of it felt too heavy for paper. Too late. And yet, doing nothing felt worse. So he wrote simply. He wrote that he had read about her book, that he was glad she lived, that he hoped she had found peace. He wrote that there was a ranch in Texas where the wind still sounded the same as it had all those years ago. He did not write her name. He did not write his, only an address. Only the truth he could bear. I never forgot you. He folded the letter and held it for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive, and placed it inside. Across the ocean, in Japan, she was older now, her hair streaked with gray, her hands steady, practiced. She had taught English for years by then, helping children born long after the war find words for a world rebuilt on silence. Her memoir had not been written for fame. It had been written because some stories grow heavier when carried, alone. Whether the letter reached her, no one knows. There was no reply. Weeks passed, months, seasons turned. He checked the mailbox less often. Eventually, he stopped waiting. But sometimes, late at night, she would wake and sit up in bed, the old blanket folded at her feet. A thought would pass through her, not regret, not longing, but something gentler, like recognition, like knowing a voice without hearing it. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it is simply the shape love takes when it learns to let go. In Osaka, in the quiet back rooms of a school tucked between rebuilt concrete and neon signs, she spent her final years surrounded by children who had never heard a bomb fall. Orphans, many of them, children whose parents had died not in war, but in poverty, in illness, in the long aftershocks of history. She taught them English with patience, never raising her voice, always correcting with a smile. They loved her, though few knew the full story behind her silence. She lived in a small home not far from the school, where the floorboards creaked and the winter wind slipped through the cracks. Every night she folded the same olive blanket over her lap, its edges worn thin by time. To her students, she was simply Kaio-sensei. To herself, she was someone who had once died and been born again. In Amarillo, the cowboy aged into a man with silver in his hair and fewer words than ever. He taught children to ride horses the way his father had taught him, slow, firm, respectful. He still kept the ranch, though he no longer did the heavy work. The land hadn't changed much, but he had. His hands bore the quiet marks of years, calluses, scars, the soft tremble that comes with age. When asked about the war, he rarely said more than a sentence or two. I served in the Pacific. That was usually enough. What he didn't say sat just behind his eyes. In the barn's back corner, on a high shelf, rested a small wooden box. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, was the bar of soap. Dry, cracked, useless maybe, but not forgotten. Some nights he'd open it just to look, to remember that once, in a world built on orders and fire, a stranger had handed him her life and called it a gift. They never met again. No reunion, no postcard, no surprise visitor on the porch. But still, they lived the rest of their lives shaped by that moment in the jungle. Not lovers, not enemies. Something else. Something harder to define, but impossible to erase. She died on a spring morning. The children planted flowers in her memory. In her will, she left behind only books, a few small letters, and a note. Please give the blanket to someone who feels cold, even when the room is warm. He passed away 2 years later. Heart failure, quiet, alone. In his top drawer, a letter addressed to no one. It read, I saw the world fall apart, and in the rubble I saw someone who chose to stand. I hope she forgave me for letting her go. Their names are not etched into any monument. Their story is not told in textbooks. But somewhere, a teacher gently wraps a student in a blanket. Somewhere else, a boy learns to hold the reins lightly, like something alive. And in these small gestures, they live. Not as ghosts, but as echoes. A woman who lived twice, once in the shadow of war, and again in the light of choice. A cowboy who carried a single act of kindness longer than any weapon. A soap, a blanket, a glance that defied everything they'd been told. Dignity is not loud, but it endures. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who values human stories, and comment where you're watching from.